At the age of 20, I promised over 50 women in Uganda that I was going to change their lives for the better. Less than 2 years later, I became overwhelmingly aware that I was failing to keep my word. The awareness of that failure set me on a 4-year journey to find out what it means to give the poor the proper tools to succeed. My story begins in a rural village in central Uganda where I started a social enterprise with a group of women who had never earned what we call a living wage. A living wage is a wage that consistently covers your basic human and social needs. I connected with a village leader named Agnes while I was working there as a media correspondent. Agnes cared deeply about the women in her community, most of whom were sex workers, and they were her friends. So they had come to her and they had confided in her that they felt that their occupation, first of all, put them in many situations where they were unsafe, and secondly, that it kept them from spending valuable time with their children, particularly at night. So Agnes was determined to find an alternative means of employment for these women, and she came to me and she asked if I would help. I said that I would. So Agnes and I sat down together and we created a business plan where Agnes would manage these women in creating accessories that they had learned to make and sell in local markets, and I would market and distribute them internationally. Together, we were going to create impact. We called it Nakate, named after a little girl who was representative of our hope that the next generation of girls could have a choice about where and how they wanted to make their money. Now, impact, by definition, is a collision. And when I was 20 and 21, I pictured my work in Uganda like an impact crater, like planets colliding, like a moon and a celestial body coming together. Like, I wanted explosions. I wanted Uganda to be different because I had been there and I had done something. I was not unlike most entrepreneurs and aid workers and writers that I met at the time working in sub-Saharan Africa, and that was that we really believed that impact was obvious. It was this shift, right? You went from poverty to financial stability. You went from sickness to health, and it was unmistakable. The formula that I knew most of us were using from conversations and collaboration with other people in my field was that you combat poverty with money, and you use opportunity to sustain the impact. So I used this equation during my first year of work, and things went really well. Sales were good. And I felt like I was saving the world. Like, Rosemary sent all of her grandchildren back to school. Annette put a roof on her house. Sarah bought pigs. And Agnes put the brick foundation on a new home for herself. Things were going great. Sales plummeted during our second year of business. And that was when it became very obvious that Agnes and I had different approaches when it came to how to make this business financially viable over the long term. So I returned to Uganda, and my goal was that I was going to improve the quality of our product, and I was going to collaborate with our artisans on better design. As I returned to do so, just remember this day sitting at a table, and Agnes is beside me, and I'm going through quality control with these women, and I'm trying to teach them. And she turns to me in front of all of our artisans, and she starts arguing with me. She says, "Don't you know how poor these women are? How can you expect them to make a perfect product? If you were telling people the stories of their desperation like you should be, they wouldn't expect a perfect product. They would just know they needed help." I remember my heart just sinking, looking around the room and feeling so little. I told Agnes that wasn't true. I told her that we were in a competitive market, that our product had to be able to stand against other products that were perfect and of beautiful quality, and she disagreed. So we spent several months going back and forth this way about our solution of how we were going to make our business viable, at the end of which Agnes wrote me an email, and she asked me not to return to the district unless I came with a wad of cash. And speaking of impact craters, I felt like somebody had made a crater inside of me. Like, I wanted to crawl under a table. I never wanted to be a social entrepreneur again. I started working with a mentor during this time that told me that I needed to push through my discouragement, because the kind of drive that it was going to take me to do so was exactly the kind of drive it takes for a woman to lift herself out of poverty. He told me that providing opportunity without showing the importance of personal responsibility for success was not creating sustainable change, because it failed to teach the importance of a transference of responsibility from the person providing the opportunity to the person receiving it. So I want you to imagine a Rube Goldberg machine with me. In it, you have several individual interactions that all stem from a single catalyst. So it may be a marble dropping, or one domino tipping into another, or a cup lifting. That initial catalyst isn't forceful, but instead it's precise. And it perfectly creates this impact that creates a second catalyst. So maybe it's one marble running down a shaft into another, or maybe it's a string lifting and it tips over a cup of liquid. As the catalysts continue, you create a machine that completes a process. And when viewed in their entirety, all these individual components create something extraordinary. I met Florence when I relaunched my work in a slum outside Kampala. Florence was struggling to provide for her family while creating handmade accessories with a group of women who were selling them at local markets. And she came to me and shared how she wanted to find a larger distribution network. And I was really honest with Florence. I told her how I felt I was a little bit of a failed entrepreneur. Like maybe I was not the right person to come to. She should find somebody a little more talented who never failed. Florence told me that was how you made things work. So she was pretty insistent. And that honest conversation became the first of many steps towards sustainable change that we did together. So we laid the foundation of our work out of a belief that poverty would be changed over the long term as we again and again and again provided these opportunities for the women within our supply chain to take responsibility for their own success. So what that looked like within our work was that a woman would begin her work with us, and she would have design tasks that were both minimal in responsibility and in compensation. And as she showed initiative with that task, she was given a task with a little bit more responsibility and a little bit more compensation. And there were about 4 levels of this kind of movement within our supply chain. As the woman showed that kind of initiative and that kind of drive and took on more responsibility, we also invested more back in her. So we'd sit down and we'd talk about her goals for her children. We'd talk about her dreams for her career outside of Nakate, and then together we would decide on what kind of measurable steps she could take to get there. And we did not put any roofs on houses, and nobody bought livestock, and I wasn't sure that anybody was putting their kids back in school, but I saw women rise above the competition around them. And I saw women who had never created plans come to me with 3-year plans and ask what I thought of the business they wanted to create over the next few years. I saw women who had never in their life saved money open savings accounts of their own initiative. And as all of that began to happen, my theory changed. And it became that poverty, combined with opportunity and sustained by a sense of competition, created sustainable impact. I had a very meaningful exchange with Florence that I feel like really illustrates the power of how this has worked out for us. We sat down earlier this year to go through her finances and to look at all of her expenses, from really large things like her rent to the kind of tea that she was buying her family for each week. And we went through the supply chain of the business as well and how she could budget. And she started crying in the middle of our talk. And I'm like, oh my God, Florence, what is wrong? She told me that her whole life as an African woman, people had tried to stamp out her poverty and her sadness, but nobody had ever told her that she was supposed to calculate small expenses. She said, I've always wondered where my money went, and I never knew. But now you've shown me it went to all the small calculations that I didn't know were part of a budget. I didn't know I was supposed to make them. The next day, I went looking for Florence to talk with her about a client order, and I found her teaching the principle of budgeting small expenses to a group of women sitting in front of her. I remember feeling like I had this image in my brain that I was like this little baby fire ant under this crazy big African blue sky. Like I was one single catalyst, one component in a series of opportunities and discouragements and relationships and choices that all made up the complete process of sustainable change in a woman's life. This fall, Florence's youngest son, Daniel, enrolled for his sophomore year studying international development at Gulu University. All 3 of her children enrolled for classes this spring. And when Florence isn't teaching women how to create our accessories or managing orders, she's out teaching local HIV awareness classes. And I realized this summer while I was there, without her saying anything to me, that she had started taking in orphans off the streets to live with her, now that she has a bigger house. During one of our most recent phone conversations, she said, "Do you think you could teach me how to use that one computer program you call Excel?" Yes, Florence, I can. What I've learned in a series of strides towards sustainable impact in Africa is that I'm more than the catalyst for a series of impactful moments in relationships. I exist within them. The women that I work with and myself, we're not so different. We're all experiencing the impact of relationships and opportunities and difficulties in our choices in our lives that one by one catalyst after another, we can choose to keep for ourselves or share with someone else. And I've come to believe that the choice to do so is the only choice that matters. It's how those original catalysts begin moving, and we become part of the chain of events impacting each of us that we might in turn impact the world. Thank you.